Okay, so I thought I would do something different this time. We shall be having videos, and then as the videos go along, you just highlight in your packet, and then we'll have quizzes over the videos. So here is this art section. Starts on page 51, and it first begins by discussing Southern and Eastern Africa and the issues with that. The problem is that once they had that meeting in Europe, and then they decided to cut up Africa, and our borders were kind of drawn up arbitrarily. So the problem is that no one culture was necessarily in one spot. So then it has difficulty when trying to discuss art, because if you try to talk a particular place, it's also about a group of different people. So the borders in the nations contradict the traditional boundaries because that was a Western imposition. And in this packet, when they're discussing art, then they will discuss Southern, Eastern, Central, and Western art. They will avoid the Northern section because that's mainly Egyptian art, which just usually gets discussed in other areas. Um, so the first sub Saharan objects appear in the West in the 1400s. What happened is that people would come over, take the objects, and they're now found in museums around the world, quite often not in Africa, but the objects are in museums by the late 19th century. Interest again peaks in African art in the 20th century, mainly in France and Germany, when they start looking at African sculpture and masks. No real authors. The artist is not as important in Africa. It was often functional, and it was even if it were a craft, it was still considered high art and utilitarian. So there could be the drums that they used, the textiles, their clothing, or the stools. Much was lost because they were made of perishables such as wood, and their art form was also body adornment in the form of tattooing and scarification and hair. And of course, those were again, art was lost due to wars and the colonials coming over and taking the pieces away or destroying them, thinking that they were pagan. Trans African aesthetics and characteristics. There is a continuity. Again, this lack of concern of authorship. There's a stress on functionality. Their art served purpose, and a centrality of the human figure. Some visual abstraction, our bodily forms may be exaggerated, and much of the art was performance. Rituals which were related to masquerade, often people wearing masks during ceremonies. So here's the southern area, and when it's referred to as Southern Africa in this section, then they are talking about Namibia, which is here. Okay, Botswana, right here. Zimbabwe, over here. Here's where the Victoria Falls is, so Zimbabwe is big. South Africa, of course. Swaziland, which is here, this little section. And then Lesotho. Okay, so this is what they mean by South Africa. One, two, three, four, five, 6 countries. Varying landscape. You have forest areas, you have desert, and the cultural groups mainly are the San, Zulu, Swazi, Soto, and Shona. There were also some settlers, the Afrikaner, and that I believe is Dutch. Now, they did not develop dynamic masking traditions or carved ancestor figures on significant scales, nothing huge. And they also had ancient rock art, more here than in Europe. Eastern Africa, then, this is the earliest evidence of development of human activity. Remember things happening along the coast. And when they're talking about Eastern African, the Sudan and South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, little section up here, Somalia, Uganda here, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, which is here, and Malawi right here, and then and Madagascar, the island, which is over here. So these are the areas that they'll be referring to. The two tallest mountains are also in this section, Mount Kenya and Mount Kilimanjaro. And this is also going to be your most ethnically diverse section. Again, remember that lots of influences and people coming along the coast. Christianity was introduced in about 313 and Islam in 614. So our first artwork is Stone Age petroglyphs, and this is in Namibia, 4000 BC to 1 CE. And this was considered prehistoric. Pre simply means before, and historic means written before. I mean, this is before written history. That's what they mean by prehistoric. Peter Garlick says that the work is the product of many different social and ethnic groups over this long period of time. So it's going to be varied and it's going to be different from others as that they lack a fundamental cognitive unity. Of course, so many different peoples and so many different cultures. And this will be very different also from their southern counterparts. They're overwhelmed by an abundance of Bushman art. In Europe, this was exciting. In Africa, finding artwork, rock work was almost an everyday occurrence in Africa. Oh, look, there's more pictures on the rock. Oh, look, more pictures on the rock. In Europe, they're like, ooh, look at this. Rock shelters, this is where they found the rock art, some of it 26,000 years old. And in Africa, they would be just these shallow rock shelters. They would be smaller than the Europe counterparts. And they would have a more common narrative scenes, dancing, fighting, hunting, performing rituals. So just kind of a record of everyday events. And then we even have a record of some Bushman artists who created this rock art from their last ancestors before they finally all kind of died away. Now, the images may have been engraved through chipping or incising. And if it were on exposed rock, then of course the rock was weathered by the weather, so much of it eroded. There are three categories of rock art. We have this fine hairline carvings, then pecking, which is when you would hammer into it to produce pockmarks, and that would be animal representations, and then geometric forms, which date from 1300 BC. So here we have an example. This is, I don't even know how to pronounce that, Tweefelfontein Valley in Namibia near Brandberg Mountain. Okay, prevalent imagery, right? We have elephants. I don't know where an elephant is, but they say, oh, right here. Okay. And rhinos. Where's the rhino? They say, oh, right here. All right, there's the rhino right there. Zebras, okay, probably these. Antelopes, right, those, right? Of 2,500 images on different various rock art, 316 are giraffes. You'll even see some hoof prints. Then here are some other different animals: gemsbok, kudu, zebras, giraffes, springbok, lions, and other cats. There was a huge slaughter of animals in the 19th century. So at first, Africa had just the widest variety of animals and wildcats until people came in and, killing away. And there were some human shapes in these 27 in total, mainly animals. On this, the giraffe and others, the giraffe is the largest. To the left is a small rhino and a lion. They're done in strict profile. There is some shading technique, if you'll notice, some shading here, right? But the most simplistic forms. The lion, however, has some shading, and you'll notice that the paws down here are actual prints, so a little different. The tail is elongated with another paw print at the top. So obviously this is not a strict representation of the lion doing this funky thing with the tail. Okay. Then we have Leidenberg heads. This is in South Africa. So second art piece. This is the Bantu migration happened around 1000 BCE, and it transforms sub-Sahara. It started in Chad and Cameroon, and today many cultures speak Bantu. There were two waves. First moved to the east to the forests of the Congo. The second then traveled along the eastern coast and inland with the rivers. And they mastered iron and crop civilization. They also introduced some crops of Asian banana and yams. Of course, we know yam is very important. Older groups become displaced, but this leads to the establishment of important cultures and creation of art. So the Leidenberg heads, discovery and reconstruction. The earliest sculptures were found in South Africa. They were found in 1962. A schoolboy found them in this eroding gully. It was a pit filled with a lot of pottery shards and beads and metal ornaments. And then they found these heads, and they were of fired clay. Of course, they were fragments. They had to put them together. They found 7 head forms. 5 were smaller, 4.25 to 4.5 inches. They were largely complete, and then there were 2 larger heads, 13 inches, which were damaged. One was not even quite complete, and they can now be found in South Africa Museum in Cape Town. They're hollow, so they thought perhaps it was just an inverted vessel. They are decorated in that it has a herringbone pattern on them with hatched lines, triangular motifs. These decorations echo the regions that they would be from. Of course, made of clay. So they may have started as pots, and the larger ones may have been masks, but less likely because once you put it on your head, that you really can't see out of it. The eyes don't quite match, so most likely not. Function's really unknown. Um, they do have human features. A smaller one had a snout, so probably not a person, hopefully, and some white pigment. And they're not quite sure exactly what that was supposed to be or represent. They may have been used in rituals, and it's also very difficult to date them. Now, this is one of the intact larger ones. The eyes echo the shape of cowrie shells, and notice that the left one is a little lower than the right. The ears appear as just crescent shapes. And what happened then is that this would have been created, and then pieces were added to it as slips of clay. So the lips then would have been added to the piece. Again, linear, we see hatching on these bottom ridges. We see line coming down from the hairline, finer lines around the eyes and the cheeks, probably representing scarification. The back, which isn't shown, also had various panels of cross-hatching. And it has a hairline here, right? Curving lines, there should be lines. And these would have been constructed using ropes of clay. Again, clay that was added. And then you'll notice that this would have represented the hair. So again, little pieces of clay added to represent a tightly curled hairstyle. And a piece of clay added at the topmost was most likely some form of animal, probably a lion, but it's very difficult to tell because it has eroded. And this would be the first human shape that was in our study. Okay, so we're going to end this one here. Oops, stop that, and we go here, and then we click end recording.